So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this talk about the Marlborough bucket. Although, as we were just discussing, I think that's entirely the wrong word, but we'll have to come up with a new one. By Rebecca Ellis, who's has pretty well. You've got your PhD, actually, haven't you?
I just need to do my corrections, and then it's all officially done, which is happening in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah. So really, you've got your PhD.
Yeah, it was accepted. Yes. Otherwise.
And she came to look at the Marlborough bucket, and she's found such amazing stuff out about it. Then we had to come and ask her to give a talk. So, thank you, Rebecca, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And as David has very much already said, I really hope to be able to put the Marlborough bucket back on the map of Iron Age studies, both in Britain and in Europe, and do it some long overdue justice. Discovered by labourers in what is thought but not proven to be a large cremation cemetery, and apparently the bucket itself did contain cremated remains that were affixed with a wooden lid. Sketches were originally made of this item by a Mr. Tuck to 1 3 inch scale. Now, it was discovered by labourers. They'd never found anything like this before, and unfortunately, very soon after exposure, the bucket itself collapsed. New sketches were then made in about 1812 by a Mr. Croker, which are the watercolour sketches you see here and which you'll see throughout the presentation. Now, these were apparently made based on the original in situ sketches by Mr. Tuck and of pieces of the Marlborough bucket that were sent to him by what sounds effectively like the postal service, slightly scarily. And unfortunately, those original drawings by Mr. Tuck were lost after 1887. So these original watercolours by Mr. Croker are the very first records, illustrative records we have of the Marlborough bucket. Now, there have been 3 major reconstructions of the bucket over its 2 centuries of existence in our modern world. And we have no impressions of the 1873 reconstruction at all, only faint records. However, we do have photographs taken by Professor Martin Jope for his Early Celtic Art in the British Isles volume of the 1967 reconstruction, and you can see some of those photos here. Now, the work for this volume, despite being published in 2000, sadly posthumously, was actually mainly done in the 60s and 80s. However, as you can see, there are quite distinct problems with these photographs for the modern researcher. They unfortunately have an issue with focus, with lighting, resolution, angles. They're not exactly done in a scientific manner. And therefore, and the other problem with these is that they've been published in a book, which is very difficult to get hold of, is now out of print. And sometimes you can't even get hold of both the illustrations and the text. And because it's sought after and rare, it gets expensive. And so there's not really been much of the Marlborough bucket in the public, or rather in the archaeological sphere, unless you end up being a specialist in the subject area. Now, between 1980 and 1986, we have records of a series of conservation works carried out at the Salisbury Conservation Centre, which I can only presume was in preparation for the 1985 arrangement, which appears to be the current iteration of the bucket on the gallery, on the Iron Age gallery at Devizes today. Now, what's really interesting about these conservation reports is that it looks as though a number of them were actually done by training students. And this is the appeal for the evening. I would love to know whether anybody knows any of the students involved. I don't have any information about an institution. I have no information about the individuals, but some initials. So if you know about that student conservation work that took place in the 80s, please get in touch. I would love to hear what your experience was like working with this object. So how do we describe the Marlborough bucket on paper? Well, it has a staggering 100-litre capacity, making it the largest surviving vessel of its kind known from Iron Age Britain of this type of construction, which is yew staves, iron coopering bands, further embellished with copper alloyed bands decorated in repousse. Interestingly, it appears as though the bucket was designed so that no wood would have been visible at all. All the plates appear to interlock to each other. Therefore, it would have potentially imitated a solid metal vessel or cauldron, but this is suggestion based on the evidence we have surviving rather than absolute fact. Now, the most remarkable thing about this vessel, which happens to be the reason that I came to meet it, is its decoration. My personal specialism is in the use of genuinely figurative animals in the art of the later Iron Age, most commonly known as Latin or Celtic art. Now, this style starts in the 5th century BC in Europe and spreads. It develops regionally. There's so many different aspects to it, you can't really stick it into 2 sentences. But basically, this style is seen as far west as Ireland and as far east as Turkey, is genuinely pan-European to an extent. Now, the Marlborough bucket is the most figuratively decorated vessel in Britain. In fact, it is possibly the second most decorated vessel in Europe, second only after the wonderful gunstruck cauldron. It is therefore a piece of European significance on principle, and yet, unfortunately, it's kind of been ignored over the years, despite having wonderful pride of place in the Iron Age gallery in Devizes. Now, we don't have any other material from the original deposit that's datable. So the rough chronological idea we've had about this bucket is that it roughly dates to the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD, 2 of the most tumultuous centuries in British archaeology, totally. But because of this, it means that we don't really know when it was constructed. There's not really been many ideas about what the decoration represents. And what hasn't been discussed is how well the Marlborough bucket fits into other similar vessels in Iron Age Britain. And the weird thing is that actually it somewhat fits into a known bucket burial tradition of the 1st century BC and AD. But you don't tend to see them in the West, you tend to see them in southern eastern England, mainly in the areas of Hertfordshire and Kent. Buckets of wood stay of construction held together with iron bands are by no means alien, as you can see from these examples here. And they're not only a thing seen in Britain, but they're also seen on the continent. And all of them can contain some really amazing, detailed and highly unique decoration, whether that be figurative or non-figurative. But sometimes our evidence isn't quite as pristine as those examples you've seen there. Unfortunately, sometimes we are quite literally reduced to fragments of iron as our only evidence, or as you can see from the other 2 images on the right, literal fragments of elements of the bucket, such as swing handle fittings, some of which certainly in the last 20 years, a lot actually have been reported by the wonderful detectorists who do report to the Portable Antiquities Scheme. And in many ways, when you look at the other bucket burials, the Marlborough bucket seems somewhat less alien. It was within a rich burial deposit, as examples from Aylesford, Alcombe, Baldock and Lenham were, containing cremated remains, if we believe those records from the 19th century, which I don't see any reason not to. Excuse me. Now, although on examples such as from Aylesford, let me just pop on my laser pointer, there we go, have moulded heads for handle fittings, we have again this revival, if you like, in the 1st century BC and AD of repoussé design. These repoussé designs often contain complex animal and human forms, and can hold active agents. They're not just static symbols. If you look at the most recently discovered Lenham bucket, it shows 2 hippocampi pulling apart a hair. Iron Age artists did not have to mince their words, their thoughts, their ideas. They were perfectly capable of transferring that onto the beaten metal plate. And to be honest, the only really major difference between the example from Marlborough and these other examples in Hertfordshire and Kent is the size. The example here from Aylesford is about 12 litres, just to give you a comparison. It's the number of individual motifs of Marlborough which really, again, make it stand out. They're much higher than other examples. And again, it's that slightly strange westerly location. If this had appeared in Hertfordshire or Kent, in a way, I really wouldn't have batted an eye, and not many others will have. Unfortunately, however, though, because we can't date Marlborough so succinctly, we can't quite tell chronologically how it fits into this bucket burial tradition of southeastern England, but I very much doubt that these things occurred completely in ignorance to one another. And given that these clearly share some aspects of burial deposit, it's just unlikely as well that they would have been ignorant of this on the continent. So there are a number of research questions here for the bucket, and I like to place into 3 specific themes just to simplify things a little bit, because it's very easy to get overwhelmed with an object like this. Chronology, as I've just covered. I really want to know, is there anything that can really hone that date down to even a 50-year time span would be amazing in this ridiculously politically complex period. What is its purpose? I say this slightly tongue in cheek. Is it wine, parties, death and destruction? Unfortunately, with very little, if any, wood surviving, we can't do lipid analysis, so we can't tell you what this contained. We have none of the cremated remains. So we're going to have to guess at what this possibly was used for. It's very unlikely that this was made purely as a cremated vessel, a cremation urn, essentially. The buckets from Lentham, the bucket from Aylesford and Baldock, they all contained cremated remains. But interestingly, this was after a life of hard use. These buckets often showed elements of repair. They had lives before being consigned in death as cremation containers. I also have to ask, with the bucket on the side, given the size of the Marlborough bucket, did this really only contain one human cremation, or could it have potentially contained multiple? We have to ask that question. And the third question is where I come in: imagery. To date, no one has really done a thorough analysis on the imagery of this piece. And in some respects, it's because there's been this presumption that we don't actually know enough about imagery and how it was used in Iron Age Britain and the near continent. Well, now that is only half true. My PhD study, which couldn't include humans due to size and time constraints, studied the use of animals and showed quite clearly that some animals were used with very specific associations and themes, such as bovines and horn capping to do with societal economic wealth and status. And it also found that some animals didn't, that their use seemed to be an aesthetic preference, a bit like a fashion statement, rather than something that had this symbolic, intangible element. And so we have to ask these questions of the Marlborough bucket. Are the humans and horses used on here just whimsical, just a fashion statement, or did they have something of meaning behind them? And can we see that? Well, to answer these questions, I don't make things easy for myself. It was clear I needed to spend some time with this piece and look at it myself rather than relying on photographs. And so I made my first initial visit back in May 2021. I soon realised that not only was this Perspex case hiding some unpublished details, but the world was in desperate need of new modern photography so that this item could come back on the archaeological map without that Perspex cover. And so in the last week of February / first week of March this year, myself and my wonderful partner, Mike Hakin, who is a whiz photographer, whereas I'm still very much learning, were massively privileged to be able to spend a whole week with the Perspex cover off this case on the gallery and photograph this amazing object. Now, this was a display-based shoot. The fragments on here are incredibly fragile, despite the best work of conservators over the years. There was no way I was going to trust myself to remove these items, place them in a studio, photograph them, and put them back. So we did an in situ photo shoot. And can I just say again, thank you so much to Lisa and David for their wonderful patience and support during this. With a long road trip, the first couple of days were a little bit hairy technically, but we got there in the end, and hopefully you'll be very pleased with some of the results you've already seen, but the rest of the results tonight. So for those of you that would like to know the technical details, we used a Nikon D780 and we used a 105mm lens to capture the stills, and we used a method called focus stacking. This is where the camera takes pictures of the same item from a fixed point at different focal distances, especially where there's a deep depth of field, so that it will take a photo where the front is in focus, it will take a series of photos going back, the final one being when the back is in focus. A clever piece of software will then stitch these all together to create an image where every single element is in perfect focus. We personally like to use a program called Affinity Photo by Serif because it's an awful lot more affordable than Adobe Photoshop, but I should express that other options are available. So because we had to do an in situ photo shoot, we realised that this meant a number of hours of digital editing would take place, and that's where my skill set comes in. So the initial photos came out something like this. So the first thing we needed to do was focus on every element and focus specifically on what we wanted to bring out in the photograph. So we isolated our focus. Then the second major issue we had with some of these is that there were rivets and hooks that got in the way of certain bits of detail that we really didn't want in the finished product. So for this, I used a technique called cloning, which is essentially taking image from elsewhere on the image, placing it where I want to place it. and magically we've managed to get rid of those hooks. And then once we've done that, all we need to do is get rid of those pesky little bits where the backing is showing through. And in this case, a little tweak on the contrast. And here we have the finished product of this particular piece. Now, this particular photograph took 2.5 hours. Some took 3 hours. The record is 4.5. Some only took 30 minutes, but it took plenty of cups of tea and coffee. And a drawing tablet. This was done manually. There is no piece of software that can pick this out and do it for you. This is a manual job. So I've teased you all enough now, really, since I've started this talk, and I'm now going to take you through each individual motif used on this bucket, the new interpretations, the new things we've found, and provide a suggestion as to who, what, when, where, and why came to be the Marlborough bucket. Now, at the top of the bucket, there are 2 plates at either end of the stave bar, and these have, since Croker's sketches of the 1800s, been identified as 2 matching pair of long-haired individuals, and here is one of them. We clearly have hair roundels, which then follow down, stop here, right halfway down the head, and turn into a lovely flowing hair with kink. And even though the right side of this is quite damaged, we can still see the kink here. So I'm very happy that this is, if you like, a twin image of 2 matching female figures. I'll show you examples of how I know these are female figures, but in short, wherever we've seen this hairstyle or similar to it on full-bodied figures in Europe, we don't seem to have one in Britain. They have been undeniably female bodies. However, there are some details about this which provide a little more food for thought. For instance, the mouths here show how actually these are not a very close twin pair, but they also provide a question of how much do we take into account tiny detail like this. It's very easy to get bogged down in, quite frankly, the difference in millimeters of some elements. And so here I'd like to usher a word of caution into how much we take detail of something like this on board. I personally think this was just chance rather than a meaningful difference on the evidence that we have surviving. There's an interesting thing here that we don't see elsewhere on the bucket, and that is an overlap of 2 different copper sheets. This suspiciously looks like a repair. And as I said to you before, we actually do see we do see elements of evidence of repairs on other buckets in Eastern England, Baldock in particular, and Aylesford. The heads and the handles clearly broke several times and were repaired several times. I have to ask, is this the evidence of repair? It is perfectly possible. And that brings me to the stave hole. It's extremely roughly cut. This is not just degradation. And if you look, it's very unevenly placed between the 2 heads. I do wonder whether something happened to this end of the plate and whether this is actually a replacement, and a replacement that was done very quickly. As I said, when we see this hairstyle in Europe, we do tend to see it on a female body. From the work I've done so far, interestingly, we seem to see the earliest iteration of this female figure actually on Philippus imitation, the earliest Gaulish coinage. And often, interestingly, as you see here in a slight variation of a slightly later coinage series, this female seems to be associated with chariotry quite particularly. We do have 2 other examples I've so far been able to find of this hairstyle in Britain, and here is one of them. Now, this is a sword shape. For those of you that don't know what that is, it's the bit of metal on the bottom of a scabbard which stops the the sword point from going straight through the bottom. And it was meant to be seen like this. This is not upside down, if you like. This is the way it would have sat on the sword scabbard itself. And here we have another twin depiction. This is from southern Wales, so it's not a million miles away. And again, we have this martial connection, which is quite unusual. A lot of food for thought here in terms of continental connections and imagery associated with females. So let's have a look on the other side. Are they the same? Since Croker's drawings of 1817, they have been, 1812, they have been considered a matching pair on both staves. Well, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, folks, this is actually a different pair entirely. The hair here actually indicates that this is a pair of males, not a pair of females, though again, a twin image. How do I know this? It might seem a little bit pie in the sky. Well, the great thing is that I've got an absolute corker of a parallel for the hairstyle that actually comes from the Czech Republic. This is a sword, anthropomorphic sword hilt head. And as you can see, the way the hair is bunched and curled is an absolute dead ringer. And what's really, really important about this piece as well is that the rounders continue for 2 more stretches down the back of the head, unlike the previous pair I showed you. But the other really amazing thing is the date. This is a known, adopted Roman hairstyle of the mid-1st century BC. We see it in the Czech Republic, we see it in France, and now we also see it in Britain. It's a really, really important dating marker. The other thing I'd like to point out about this piece is how neatly that stave hole is cut. It is nowhere near as rough as the previous example. You can also see here how the edges curl over. And on the current display, you will see there is metal on the back of this where the stave comes in. And again, that indicates to me that this whole vessel, anything that was not covered by contents, was covered in metal to potentially imitate one of these huge cauldrons. And what's interesting again with these male figures is that they have a high status and martial connection found on swords and in statuary. So already just in 2 motifs, we have 3 hugely important things that are new to the Marlborough bucket, new to its story. We have a gender balance. Normally when Iron Age society is dramatized or illustrated, it's warrior males with mustaches all the way. We've got something quite different here, and that's really important to remember. We have a clear indicator of continental connections. Whoever this was made for, whoever it was made by, have this awareness of styles on the continent, certainly of the mid-1st century BC, and that wonderful dating marker of that rounded hair nail, mid-1st century BC. So let's move on to the first band, the first full band of the bucket, and here we do have that more classic mustachioed male of that description that has, if you like, haunted archaeologists since Caesar's writings and many, many other writers since. Here we have wonderful swept back hair in a side profile that we don't actually see elsewhere in Britain. This is the unique in the way the hair is beautifully brought back to these rounded finishes. Here we have that mustache. Now there is a twin, if you like, of this item. Unfortunately, only the eye part remains. The hair looks identical, and it is likely it was another mustachioed male, but unfortunately we cannot be entirely certain because even in Croker's drawings, the chin had already gone, so we can't say this for absolute certainty. Now, we've seen the mustachioed male from the 5th century BC in Europe. He is a typical archetypal male character in art. And we also see him all the way through to the 1st century BC and AD in Britain. This is one of the 3 heads from the whirlwind burial. But we also see them potentially not just within the realms of secular power, but potentially ritualistic as well. This is specifically for Britain. This, apologies for the photo, it's the only one that exists. This is a silver unit of the Regni, which was an apparent tribe attributed to the Sussex coast. Here we have a mustachioed male wearing a wheeled headdress. Interestingly, an absolute corker of a wheeled headdress has actually been discovered in the last 20 years from Guildford Roman Temple. So in Britain, individuals, mustachioed males, may have had both secular and or ritualistic power. It's a little consideration for future research. And I want to go back to the way that hair is done, the specific way the hair is bunched at the end in those beautiful, beautiful locks. And there is a relatively close parallel to that on coinage again. This is ABC Ancient British Coinage number 103, Champagne Wildman, a bronze potin that's attributed to the Senones of Gaul. And as you can see, it's actually a very close match for the hairstyle, where one in Britain otherwise does not exist. Now, these were minted in Gaul, but we do also see them imported into Britain and date to the 80 to 50 BC marker. So again, we're not far away from that mid-1st century BC date. Now, here is a piece that I don't believe has actually been photographed at all or printed, and most people haven't seen or realised. We don't actually just have animal and human imagery on the bucket. We have non-figurative vegetal work as well. Now, this piece is only 5 centimeters tall. It is currently around from the side of where the mustachioed males are, just past the extra stave. And as you can see here, it shows a twirl coming in, and there's the remains of something else just going out over here that unfortunately we just don't have the remains of anymore. And again, this example from a bucket burial in VL Toulouse again illustrates that these buckets could be decorated both vegetatively and with figurative forms. And also, just to be aware, this is actually one of the photographs we're not quite perfectly happy with. It's something that we would like to go back, get the lighting better so it looks less flat across the middle. Practice makes perfect. Now, the final element of band 1 is one which appears to survive, it's the first to survive, is the first pair of horses. These are quite fragmented, but we can still get some really important information, such as the way the tail is done. It would have curled up from the back end and is now up here. There are a pair clearly leaping or moving. There's clearly some animation here towards an item which, quite frankly, I can't identify, and I'm not even going to try. I'm not going to try and suggest any form of association for fear of suggesting something I shouldn't. I've tried to work out if this is some early form of horse collar, which aren't thought to come in until the Anglo-Saxon period. Is it a pair of blacksmith's tongs, some shears that have gone wrong? I honestly don't know. And sometimes you've just got to admit that you don't know for the sake of safety. And this is one of those elements. But interestingly, this plate, along with the conservation reports, was an example where modern photography is really going to benefit this object. Here, behind the mane, we have some very, very fine hairline texturing patterns. These may well indicate individual strands of horse's hair in the blowing mane as those horses are moving forward. But what is equally of really important interest is we have other geometric incised decoration that is just surviving amongst otherwise a corroded surface. Now, some of this could just be, if you like, texturing of movement. Other elements, such as this line here and the line coming down here, and this parallel pair that goes through here, I'm really not sure that's the case. We'd like to come back and have a look at this plate and a couple of others with a technique called reflectance transformation imaging, shortened to RTI, which will hopefully bring this detail that survives out. So despite answering a lot of questions, the photography is also bringing up a load more. The theme of this talk is going to be just how much more work there is actually to do. We seem to have only scratched the surface. And there's another really interesting mystery with horse pet A that I can now declare solved, to do with the 19th century croquet watercolours. Here you can see in the red band that we have, instead of a pair of horses, a slightly odd, weird, winged, possibly Nike figure. And it took me a little while to work out what had actually happened. Horse pet A have been drawn upside down. And this at first made me really worry about the reliability of these 19th century drawings. However, everything else is so otherwise accurate. This is again about just applying gentle caution. So horse pet A are there on the bucket. Unfortunately, they're just upside down, and it just reminds us to be a little bit careful and make sure we evaluate the sources we use. So after that mystery, I'm going to go on to the second full band of the bucket, back to this form that you've already seen this evening. Now, this band contains 2 humans, and this, unfortunately, is by far the most fragmentary. But there's some 2 really interesting things about it, and one of them is actually key to identifying how this would have once looked. Firstly, you will see there's this silver sheen to the whites of the eyes. This is actually tinning. So not only when new would this bucket have the decorated bands of this bucket shone brassy gold with texturing bits that will dance in firelight, the whites of the eyes of these humans that face outwards would have also shone bright silver. Gaudy is perhaps one of the words you could use. I'm slightly terrified of trying to do a faithful reconstruction of this digitally because it's going to be so bright. But the other really interesting thing is the parting and the hair flow. It's a slightly just off central parting, but the hair flow down the sides of the face actually meant that this could be identified. And the best way to show you what it would have looked like is to show you the best example, which is from a 1st century BC cauldron from Rinkeby in Denmark. Jope originally identified this in his posthumous 2000 work, or the work that was published after his death, sorry, in 2000. And I absolutely agree with him. This would have been a bobbed-haired female character, which again we see on coinage elsewhere in Europe. We see on art elsewhere in Europe, particularly potentially the Voldolgesheim princess burial is possibly the earliest iteration, but again, more work is to be done. And we see it elsewhere in Britain as well. This is a vessel fitting for the shoulder of a bowl from Lincolnshire. Now, I wouldn't expect any of the items on the Marlborough bucket to be wearing torques, so don't necessarily take that into your reconstruction. There are no accessories that are surviving in evidence, and so I'm not just going to suggest that they're all going to be wearing torques. It doesn't quite work that way. And as you can see, this hairstyle is used over Europe. Again, continental connections are key. But on the opposite side of the bucket is perhaps one of the stars of the show, one of the most complete outwardly facing human faces, especially when you take off the lid. The eyes just pop when you do. Now, the hairline here is much better preserved than our previous examples, and it's nice and easy to see that the hair is slicked back from the hairline. This is actually one of the most common examples of hairstyle we see on male depictions actually throughout Iron Age Europe. And here, just going back to the whirlwind head I showed you earlier with our mustachioed male, he actually has the same top hair design. It's used very, very often. Now, the other thing to note with this is that fantastic tinning of the eyes. But when reading the conservation reports, something really interesting popped out. On this particular piece, there isn't just tinning on the front of the eyes, but there's evidence of tinning along the eye points, along the eyelids, on the back. And you have to ask yourself, why on earth would they tin and waste time and material on a definite non-presentation face? And believe it or not, looking at some of the scientific reports of the last few years from the Gundestrup cauldron actually brought about an answer. This is the most decorated vessel in Iron Age Europe. It's made of silver, possibly with Dacian techniques. It's a bit of a heated area. I'm not going to go into the imagery, who might have made it or where it might have been made. It was found in Denmark, and that's all I'm going to say, because it's quite a hot topic of debate. But interestingly, they also found on the backs of the eyes evidence of tin. And the references you can go ahead and read for yourselves here. And what they came to realize was that glass studs in the backs of these eyes were held in place with a tin putty, a tin paste, effectively. And it looks as though that's exactly what happened with the Marlborough bucket as well. And it would have been on both of these. So again, 3 really important considerations here from the humans on the second band of the bucket. There would have been glass studs behind these eyes. I doubt they would have been the purple glass that we see in Gundestrup. I would personally bet for a blue or red glass, personally. I could be wrong. But again, there is gender balance, which is so important to see, and something that, again, we're just not used to discussing when it comes to human figurative imagery. And again, familiarity with continental imaging techniques, continental construction techniques, and society at large. Again, continental connections is something that's going to keep coming up here. So let's have a look at the horses on this band. Excuse me a moment. I can just hear it starting to snow as well. Now, there are 2 styles of horses on this band, but with very subtle differences. In body shape, they very much look the same. Now, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is this shape of tail. Now, we don't have Arab-type horses in the Iron Age in Britain. We have something more akin to fell ponies. This is a human-made stylistic decision of this horse. This, for me, as a horsewoman, and my other half used to actually breed shires, we recognise this straight away. This is a shaven horsetail. This is something that the owners of this horse have done. And there's normally only one reason, or potentially 2 reasons, but normally only one reason why this is done. And it was very well known in the 19th and 20th centuries. Horsetails were either shaved or, I'm very sorry to say, horrifically and barbarically docked, quite literally, so that the tail hair did not get caught in machinery. It was actually a health and safety practice. We're now having to ask ourselves how long ago that health and safety practice started in Britain and on the continent, because this is something that could be done for an animal that's pulling a farm cart, but it could also be done for an animal that's pulling a chariot. Food for thought, but it's actually a really important consideration about how horses were cared for and aesthetically altered in the Iron Age. Now we have this appendage under the chin here. Now the first thing this reminded me of was a grazing mustache that horses sometimes develop in the winter and graze off, rub off in the spring. However, it could also be that where some horses do have slightly more beady underchins, they're just naturally a bit hairier there. I'm not going to put too much stock in this as a stylistic thing because we just don't have enough information. But the other really important aspect about this horse are these very faint lines of repoussé decoration. They are Le 10 swirls. This one's not as well developed as this one here. They could either be evidence that individuals were painting their horses with woad. We have plenty of comments for classical writers that Celts themselves, Iron Age populations, were famous for painting themselves. It could also be that it's just a very decorative way of showing the musculature of the horse. But something else appeared on this, which some of you would have heard us talk about before we started this lecture. Something appeared, which now I've seen, I can't unsee, and I'm going to have to come back and photograph this. And David has assured me that I'm not just seeing things on the photograph. He's gone and checked, and it's absolutely there. In this square box, which I'm blowing up as best as I can, on the horse body, we have this diamond shape. And in it, a suspiciously Triskel-like three-pronged motif. This could potentially be the first evidence we have for horse branding or horse painting proper in the Iron Age of Britain, possibly the continent. And we want to go back again with the RTI technique and possibly some infrared imaging as well to try and bring this out, because it's very faint and surface corrosion is what's made it even fainter. This is a super, super important find. Now we have, oh yes, and of course the theme. Still, I told you there's so much more to do with this. This is the horse on the other side facing towards that female figure. And again, it's done in the same way. We have, however, a slightly less obvious chin appendage, which again just suggests to me it's a stylistic thing that isn't necessarily of great symbolic importance. We again also have the way the Le 10 scrolls, which again could suggest musculature. But here we have a tiny three-pronged stain. It could be another one of those stamps. These horses could really match that closely. Unfortunately, however, it's just not as well preserved on this example. Then we're going to look at the horse which is next to the male figure. And the main difference here is the lack of that muscular decoration. And this appears to be a conscious decision. Now, just to explain, these images are not to scale. They are just all placed on this side on the slide at relative proportion, just for illustrative purposes. They're not truly to scale. Is this a coincidence that the decorated horses are associated with the female depiction and that the plain horse is associated with the male depiction? Is it a coincidence? Possibly, possibly not. The reason I'm cautious about this is because none of the pieces of these horses actively definitely fit against their human counterparts. Even though there's a bit of a chin here, there's no guarantee it actually belongs to this piece. So I'm just being cautious in case these horses are not with their original human partners, if you like. Now, I mentioned with dealing with horseband A earlier that I couldn't actually get a precise match. I did look in the wider art. I couldn't get a horse that stylistically matched. So I then looked at horse style B. My PhD looked actually specifically into horse figurines as well as other species in England and Wales. And horses are actually not very popular in wider art, only 5% of the overall sample. And of these, there were only 9 figurines. Of the 9 figurines, only 4 had tails that were surviving. Of those 4, only 2 had a docked tail. 1 came from a definite 1st century AD deposit at Corventine as well in Northumbria. This left 1, which is quite frankly the worst executed horse, and possibly not even Iron Age, it has to be said. This was actually found in Worcestershire, not a million miles away. It's part of a series of lead figurines reported to the PAS, which require further analysis. And you see here this upright, shaven tail. However, this is not the only set of material culture where we see this dock tail. And it actually transpired, we start seeing it in coinage. Now, very quickly, apart from in Kent, where they start minting their own bronze potens in about the 120 to 100 BC period, the current wisdom is that populations in Britain did not start minting their own coinage in any great number until about 60 BC, when we get the first gold status. However, they were still involved in the decades prior with exchanging coinage, which at this time was probably used for mercenary pay, but we're not 100% sure actually how it functioned quite in society. And the first huge series of coinage that we actually see in Britain, we've actually got coin dice, so we could have had them minted in Britain, jury's out, are these. They are John Sill's 2003 classified Gallo-Belgic AA status. And these have a short shaven tail. However, these are 100 years too early for the Marlborough bucket, at least, given the dating parameters we so far have. But what these did do was inspire the next series of coinage, and they are the CA1 status, which again we think are made on the continent, but again come to Britain. The tail remains. We're getting closer in date. These are to the 80 to 60 BC period, possibly stopping by the point of the Gallic Wars. But again, it's perhaps just a little bit too early. Do they continue? Yes, they do. These further inspired two further series. The first, which is currently considered to be minted in Britain, the Gallo-Belgic CF Insular series, again, Sill's 2003 classifications here. And a second set, which I haven't pictured, the Gallo-Belgic E series, which are thought to be minted in Gallo-Belgica. The tail is there, but there is a catch. Coin die design seems to not keep a record of its own history. There is not this memory. And unfortunately, what happens, what started as an upright dock tail starts moving along the back of the body and becomes this random crescent-shaped shape. So it's a catch, although these date perfectly to that mid-1st century BC period, as indicated by that male horse style. There's a catch in the evidence, so we cannot say definitively that these are the absolute direct inspiration for the shaved-tail horses of the Marlborough bucket. But again, it shows continental styles, continental connections are so important to this piece. Now, there are two otherwise unmentioned and unpublished pieces, again, on this band of this bucket. One is another vegetative swirl. Again, we want to come back and rephotograph this. It could be that this belongs to band A. It could be it belongs to band B. The jury is out. It is not on the Croker drawings, but it's still another piece of evidence of vegetative form. And the second is even smaller. And it was easier to get a photo like this, just so you can see how small this piece of evidence is. So just behind the back end of the left-facing horse next to the female on band 2, and before the handle comes in, the handle is realistically more around here, we have this little bit here. And this is potentially a horse ear of a potentially now lost 5th style of horse, which is headache inducing, quite honestly. Unfortunately, that's all we are left with, and that's all we can say about it. So let's move on to band 3, which is the most fragmentary of the bands and where we have to do a little bit more guesswork, but we can still pull out some really decent results. This is another forward-facing male. It's exactly like the one we saw earlier, it just happens to be on band 3. The clues here are once again the hairline and the flow of hair. And again, we've got that consistent tinning of the eyes on the front of the object. But what's really important about this piece is that it does have an element that adheres to a horse. This is the side of that face. The horse is plain. So is that association between male figures and or rather plainer horses something? It certainly seems less of a coincidence now on balance. It's quite possibly a very specific aesthetic relationship. Then we have a second pair of horses on the bottom of this bucket, and this is where things get even weirder. These, like pair A, move into each other as though in movement. They have, however, very strange, giraffe-like, quite frankly, long tongues. And more like style B, however, they have again these shaved, though slightly fuller tails. And the really, I don't want to say disturbing, but the thing that, if you like, bugs me about this is that horses with long tongues, I've only ever seen elsewhere in one place. In Europe, once again, and that is on coinage of the Parisi of the Paris Basin in Gaul. You can quite clearly see here these appendages, these lines, if you like, from the mouth. And on this central example of a gold stater in particular, not only does the appendage rise like the others, but we have enough of the coin die preserved on the beaten metal to show how it comes down to this curved end. Rather than tongues, these are possibly lead reins. The jury is out. It could just be that this is part of a general motif and to do with flamboyancy and some other social idea that's just lost to time. Date-wise, these are unfortunately incredibly difficult to date. They could date anywhere from 100 BC to 65 BC. There just is not the information out there. But once again, it is showing the staggering continental connections between the imagery on this bucket and not imagery elsewhere in Britain, but elsewhere on the continent, particularly to coinage. And the other thing we can see here is actually a split tail, but that has an upright element. And what's really interesting, actually, in some modern polo horse grooming practice and also in Clydesdale showing practice, Clydesdales are another big heavy horse breed, split tails are still done. So the top of the womb bone, the tailbone, will actually be shaved, but the tail underneath will be left and plaited. And so when showing, especially if the horse's tail is up, you will get exactly this effect that we see on coinage from 2000 years ago. There is an awful lot of information on the Marlborough bucket here about horse aesthetic, which quite frankly could have a lecture and a study all of its own kind. So moving on, we really then do get into the nitty gritty bitty. This is a side profile of a human form. And this is actually recorded by Croker, which is quite fascinating actually, which is rather wonderful. Here you can see hair roundels. You can also see texturing for hair sweeping back at the top here, and a lovely lock of hair down here. I have not been able to find a matching parallel of this profile in art in England and Wales, but I have found it on coinage in Gaul. We have it here, the roundels, or a swirl roundel form with the hair here from a coin attributed to the Arvernes. We have a much closer match with actual roundels here from Pictones, central Gaul, which is a central coastal Western Gaul, and a variation here, again from Parisi coinage, the coinage where the horses were that I showed you earlier. Again, I can't say enough the importance of continental imagery here and connections. And finally, the tiniest fragment left, just here. This is just the end of a hair roundel, just coming in here. It's possible that this is even a seventh human depiction. It's also possible that this actually belongs to that previous Parisi fragment. I'm going to do some retrofitting and digitally and see if we can match it to any edges that are there, because it's possible it does fit to that. But if not, it's another evidence of a potential seventh human depiction. So what does band 3 of the Marlborough bucket tell us? It's all about connections, connections, connections to the continent. Again, please note these are not to scale. I've just done this relative to illustrate on the slide the mass complexity, the workmanship, and the craziness that has been my life for the last 3 weeks of this wonderful, wonderful piece of Iron Age archaeology. And when you look at it all like this, and when you study the material culture and you're trying to answer the who, what, when, where, and why, the real key evidence for me are the inclusion of so many different types of horses. There is no other piece in Britain, or that I'm aware of on the continent, that has so many different styles of horses all decorating the same object. But the only place where you see such different styles of horses in the singular is on Iron Age coinage. And often these horses are, if you like, representative, motif representative, symbolic, if you like, of the individual minting run, the individual person, or the individual social political unit from whom they are minted. It's therefore very possible that here on the Marlborough bucket, the horses represent up to 4, if not 5, different political units, political groups. We can possibly even identify at least one of these being the Parisi of the Paris Basin in Gaul, given the horse style on Bandsea. And then I have to ask the question that given that there is no violence, no obvious domination of certain symbols over others on this bucket, in fact, there is balance, there is harmony. And just to reiterate, Iron Age artists were perfectly capable of illustrating scenes. As I explained earlier, the recently discovered Lennon bucket in Kent has 2 hippocampi pulling apart a hair. They were perfectly capable of doing this type of art in their repertoire, but they've chosen here not to do it. Why do all these figures, why are they all treated so equally? Why are they all treated with such grace on an item which could very well be used as a point of an item that can be used for group storytelling? Other buckets with other decoration, such as the example from Aylesford and Lenham, they're active agents that have storytelling. There's something about it, even if we don't know the specific details of those tales today, they're lost to time, but they're definitely communicating something. Is that what we have here, that on a piece that could potentially feed hundreds, contain tens in terms of cremations? Is there something to do with this political unity? And then there's only really one question you can ask. What happened in the mid-1st century BC, thanks to the dating markers we've got? What happened which may have forced a representation of political unity? And I hate to say it, but the only answer that I can come up with is the Gallic Wars of 58 to 52 BC and Julius Caesar's political expansion, which led to revolt, bloodshed, and a total political change, or a total change of the political landscape in Iron Age Gaul and Britain. It was never to be the same again. So to try and answer those questions that I set myself at the start of this talk, I asked who, what, when, where, and why. So who created the Marlborough bucket? Well, given the evidence we have so far from Britain and Europe, it appears the gender balance, the lack of violence, the apparent unity, the evenness of the decoration, the variety of horses in particular, as well as humans. It seems as though this was potentially a piece made or agreed to be made by several political groups, all potentially as a symbol of political alliance against political pressure. It was, in terms of what, it was a vessel which displayed this political unity, potentially. This is just an interpretation. And that this political entity would have been displayed for all to see in the most gaudy, wonderful, shining firelight of red or blue glass eyes, the whites of the eyes, the gold brassiness of the copper alloy, and the silver of the iron. I mean, this really would have been a spectacle like no other. The vessel itself looks as though it was possibly used. It certainly seems to have been damaged. Was it used at a great big party and somebody knocked it over? Without a TARDIS, I can't tell you. When? Well, again, that dating of that male style, the borrowed Roman hairstyle of that stave is really, really crucial to giving a 1st century BC marker as the earliest possible date. It cannot be earlier than that. Where? Well, this is where things are a little tricky. There are so many elements of continental imagery here that we just don't see elsewhere in Britain. I see 2 scenarios. Either this piece was made in continental Europe and for some reason became shipped out to Britain to one of the other groups that joined in on this. I think the political groups that were responsible were certainly on both sides of the channel. That potentially happened. Secondly, it was made in Britain by a selection of craftspeople either from the continent or certainly with this continental knowledge. And why? As I've said, possibly, I suggest, and it is only a suggestion, that the creation of this vessel was a sign of political allegiance against an indomitable foe. That was Caesar. But of all the conclusions, which you may or may not agree with, that I've given to you this evening, there is one thing that is absolutely certain, and that there is far more work that now needs to be done. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Sorry about that. I just dipped out for a moment. So sorry about that. Okay. So thank you so much for that. And I see my my light is causing problems. Before we go to the questions that have just been asked, earlier someone asked where the bucket had come from. And if I just share my screen for a moment, I've got the find spot up on the historic environment record. So here we go. Actually, I'm not sure what you can see. Can you see a map, or have you got things in front?
We've got the map on the web page there, David.
Excellent. Right. Okay. I've got other things in front for what I'm seeing. So this is the Wiltshire Council Archaeology Service Historic Environment Record, previously known as Sites and Monuments Record. This is Marlborough. The marketplace is over here. The town hall is there somewhere. And this is the road to Salisbury. This is the London Road. And this is St Margaret's Mead. And it's just there.
About there.
So from what I know of the find spot, it's the approximate area rather than it being precise, but it's within a sort of 50 yards of there. Right, now, sorry, going to the questions that have been asked. Roger has said that he understands the Iron Age tribe at Forest Hill Marlborough minted coins. Are there any stylistic comparisons between the imagery on the bucket and that on the Forest Hill coins?
Okay, so the Forest Hill, I'm going to presume, are those that would probably come under the ABC East Wiltshire group. Now, they're a really strange group of coins. In fact, coinage in this area of the world is a little bit strange. It's kind of on a borderland between several groups. You've got the Durogaches, you got the Bunny in the north, and then you've got this slightly weird pre-35 BC group of coins. Now, in terms of the tail over the back of the horse, as in horse pair A, technically not. However, if the full tail was taken as a straight tail, not in that animated position, then yes, there are a couple of parallels to the coins that date somewhat to the 50 to 25 BC marker of this ABC East Wiltshire group. It's just not a very easy, straightforward comparison, and hence I'm quite tentative about making it. So yes, there is some parallel, but it's not as close as the others that I've shown you this evening.
Okay, thanks. And Chris has asked, in view of the different styles, is it possible it was actually made by several different people contributing to the same vessel?
Yeah, it is quite possible. We often do see actually evidence throughout the Iron Age period of some people will do decoration, and they might be different to those that actually construct the piece. We also have evidence of apprenticeship. One piece in particular that reminds me of that is the Ratcliffe-on-Soar shield from the River Soar in Nottingham. Two elements of the decoration. This is about 200 years older than the marble bucket. Two of the elements of decoration, top and bottom, one of them was clearly done by somebody who absolutely knew what they were doing, complex tendril pattern. The other end was somebody who clearly did not. So you do see evidence for that. And yes, it's quite possible that multiple people came together to undertake this massive feat, certainly.
And a comment from Ian, or Wendy and Ian, not a question, but a quiet comment. By far the best lecture we've seen in over 2 years at these Wiltshire Museum talks.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful vote of confidence.
I do try. I have to say, I do miss actually lolloping about in a lecture theatre. I'm quite an animated speaker. I do miss it, but I'm so glad it comes across. Thank you so much.
You wander around to wave your arms about.
I do.
I
can't help it.
Okay, and if we go to the chat, Daphne has said, don't forget there were countless Belgic refugees resettling in Hampshire and Wiltshire in the mid-1st century. And
yes, there absolutely was.
Sills chapter 14, which means nothing to me, but I'm sure it does to you.
It does to me. No, there absolutely was. From the evidence we have, it's often the difficulty is actually untangling all the strands to see direct correlations between evidence. We've got a heap of evidence in terms of place name, in terms of coinage, but trying to work out what came first, middle, and last, and how it progressed is a much more difficult thing. And that's the other difficult thing with the bucket. And also the other connection we don't see is that connection to southeastern England, the Hertfordshire and Kent, and the bucket burial tradition there. We still haven't got quite a solid connection there, though. As I said, I can't see these happening in ignorance of each other. Trying to get that connection there would also be an excellent thing in the long run.
Daphne has said she can say something. I can pick. I can, Daphne, if you're happy, I can turn on your microphone, I think. I'll have to find you on. I have to find you on another bit of the system. Bear with me, if you wouldn't mind.
No worries. Thank you for all the lovely comments, folks. I'm glad it's gone down well. Thank you, David.
And I can't find Daphne on the list. No, you'd think it. Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Oh, do you want me? Oh no, can I? Yeah, no, I can't do it. Daphne's got a hand raised, but I can't do it either.
In which case, I can possibly find her from that. Got her. Right. There we go. So Daphne can now talk. And Daphne, you're on mute yourself at the moment, I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Could you introduce yourself briefly?
I'm Daphne Nash Briggs. I know a thing or two about the
hello. Right, this could go down well or poorly.
What you've done is sings to my soul. It was absolutely beautiful. And once more, I could show you on the Aylesford bucket that those people with the bubbles on, they come from Aulerci eburovices. I mean, as far as I can see, John Sills, bless his heart, was absolutely right. They must have had politics.
Absolutely.
They must have had large numbers of immigrants, which for the period between, let us say, 50 BC and 30, were just pouring into and having to be dealt with and having helped the locals in primarily, I mean, there were other things elsewhere in Britain, but in Hampshire and towards Wiltshire. If you look at the coins of the Berkshire group and the East Wiltshire group, they have a thing about paired horses and paired horses. Those hairstyles you find in the Berkshire group as well as you find. I thought the detail about the horse tail was absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you so much. And I'm so glad somebody's appreciated the comparison to coinage.
No. It's rich and beautiful, and that possible Tamgas-like emblazoning on the side of the horse.
I'm so looking forward to.
These were people who could write, but they didn't write much, so they used symbols. You'll find almost exactly that kite pattern. I've somewhere in the chat, you'll see it. One of the Coriol Torvian coin images.
Yes, I'm fully aware of it. It did spring to mind, yeah.
And the more you go into it, the more it is absolutely obvious that every single community that produced coinage in Britain, they were like the Normans. You don't know who else was living there, but they themselves, time and again, are Belgae. And that's all.
Thank you so much.
And if ever you want to get in touch, I could talk all night.
Me, you both. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Right. Fantastic. Thank you. Couple more questions have come in. Sarah and Mike have asked, has anybody worked out if it'd be possible to pick up this bucket, vat, tub if it had liquid in it?
Yeah, well, this is something I've thought about. And I have to say, I think once it was full, I think it would have been somewhat impossible. And perhaps that's why that stave plate became broken. Perhaps this is what caused the damage. I haven't done the math. I would have to go away and do the math as to how much it would have weighed with, U construction, iron bands, then with the copper alloy, then with a potential wine liquid contained. We'd have to do some maths, but I think it would be far too heavy. I think once it was on display, it was there, and it was almost like a sculpture in an art gallery in terms of you would have had people walking around it, using from it, in my own little word without a TARDIS, I admit. But yeah, this I think would have been there to stay, to be seen. I really do. And that might be how it became damaged.
It'd be like one of those big sort of crystal bowls full of punch bowls.
Yes, just 100 times the size. Yeah.
But you get huge ones that certainly you would never be able to hold to carry. So you fill them up. Well, sort of in situ.
Yep, and keep
And
it
then,
going.
yep, but you got to finish it, of course.
Yeah, well, we do actually have in the early Welsh and Irish annal literature the idea of cauldrons that never go empty. Is this why, was this the inspiration of a bucket that never ran dry?
Melanie, the county archaeologist, has said, such a shame we have so little information about the context of the original grave find.
I agree.
I assume we can't be sure the bucket would be an isolated object, or whether there may be other rich graves in the vicinity.
If the ground was open to geophysics and not built on, potentially, I'd have been straight there.
Built on.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, this is where I think another up-to-date analysis of artifactual and archaeology through planning framework needs to be done in this area, and just bring it all up to date more.
There was a site excavated not long ago, just up the road, which Melanie will know more about. Yeah, and Melanie says part of it's a recreation ground, so potentially could be open for geophys. There was a site excavated just up the road under a new school and housing development, and that had some Bronze Age finds on it, which is interesting.
I mean, let's face it, it's not exactly an empty landscape near Marlborough. It's quite possible there's so much.
Well, there is, and yes. At the top of the hill, of course, is an Iron Age hill fort, which then is looking down over what became the Roman town of Cunetio. Yeah. So there's quite a lot. It's quite busy up in that neck of the woods.
Just a bit. It's a lot busier than up here, put it that way.
Yeah. So Melanie's challenged somebody to perhaps think about doing some geophysics.
That's something we can talk about as well. My other hat is with the Roman Roads Research Association, and community geophysics is what we also do as part of our research framework. So yes, very open to those conversations.
Okay, well, I think there's someone on the call who could potentially be interested. We've got Liz, who said, with regards to the upside down horses, I'm reminded of something that Ian Armitt wrote in his book on headhunting about the Stannic Horde male heads. They were designed to be displayed either one way to represent the living and the other to represent the dead. Maybe not an artistic error, but a correct rendering. Question.
Okay, so here's the thing. With all due respect to Ian and his work, here's the great problem with the Stannic Horde. First of all, we don't know that they were ever attached to buckets. They were found apart and they're found in bits. We're presuming they're part of decorating a vessel. That's caution number one. Caution number two, artistically, they are so alien and out of context with everything and anything, they are not comparable with anything. And therefore, actually trying to understand what they are, how they fit into the artistic landscape, and what the hell they represent is unfortunately actually technically impossible. And so as much as I love what people have written about this, I'm sorry, I have to be the party pooper. And I have to just on the side of caution when it comes to interpretations like this. When it comes to animal and human representation, which is animal representation, is my specialism. Horses are only ever used, I agree, in partnership with human forms and other, but this would be the only example of such a combination in such a way, such a Frankenstein's monster element. Sorry, I'm trying to think of the right word and I can't quite think, but you get what I mean. And it is possible that it is meant to be the symbolism of horse and human and status, but I just caution when it comes to an interpretation like that, because they are so alien to their landscape. We don't actually get decent lateen art in the north until the very late 1st century BC, 1st century AD. It seems to be adopted as some new expression of elite. It's a totally different story to all the other art in southern Britain. It needs to be treated separately that way. So I'm sorry to be a party pooper on the Stannic Horde, but this is where I very much advocate caution over theorizing beautifully. I hope that kind of helps to answer where that sits on the research scale.
Okay, well, I think I think that's more or less it for questions. But what lovely comment from Miles Russell, who I think you know. Yes. Fantastic talk. The Marlborough Uber-urn is now officially my favourite Iron Age object. It's great to hear such a wonderful talk about the bucket. And when you first sort of came, and I said I think this is the most underrated object in the collections, or words to that effect. I think tonight you've shown how that I was perhaps not wrong. So huge huge vote of thanks to you for an absolutely fascinating talk.
No, thank you for hosting me and allowing my craziness to infect your gallery. And yeah, it's one of the most underrated objects in Europe. Quite frankly, it deserves to be celebrated much more.
Well, I think from now it might well be.
Hopefully.
And look forward to an article appearing in our archaeological magazine at some point in the future.
Later this year. I have corrections to do. If I don't do corrections, I shall be lynched. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And do remember our next talk, which whatever that is, because I've now forgotten. But thank you, everyone, for coming, and see you next time. Good night.